Today I want to talk about the importance of grammar. So why does grammar matter? When you write, grammar matters because it helps you establish your own credibility and it helps you maintain a reader-centered approach to writing. When we talk about establishing credibility, we actually use the model Aristotle created in the Appeals of Argument. Aristotle wrote that there were three ways that people won arguments. In that, he's speaking of speeches and oratory events, but these can also be translated into academic writing. So the three appeals of argument are logos, which means logic, pathos, which means emotion, and ethos, which means ethics and credibility. For this lesson, we're going to concentrate on ethos. On Rhetoric, Aristotle defines ethos as being trustworthy. And he later broadened that definition to include the idea that people are more likely to be persuaded by someone who is similar to themselves, similar to the audience. So that's why when you use certain words in an academic setting, you're establishing your credibility because you're using sentence structure and vocabulary that's on an academic level, as opposed to writing on a lower level for maybe high school students or even grammar school students. So to establish ethos, the writer must be trustworthy as perceived by the readers, must be similar to the readers. This has to do with tone and a reader-centered approach, and must be an authority. And that goes to grammar and format. In writing, the reader does not see you. So to establish ethos, you have to use correct grammar, sentence structure, and formatting. This builds trust with your reader. If the reader can trust that what you're saying is well said and you're following the rules set forth by the guidelines that you have for writing, then you're going to be trustworthy. It's like when you're in a personal relationship and you break trust, it's very hard to get that back. So let's watch this video on YouTube.
This video will focus on the first of the three appeals, ethos. When analyzing the ethos of a text, we're assessing the believability and credibility of the author. For instance, does the author have the appropriate credentials for the argument she or he is making? Oftentimes, students see that an author has a PhD, then they stop there. What's the PhD in? If we take a look at this article on deep reading and the brain and scroll down to view the author's credentials, we see that she directs the Center for Reading and Language Research and is a professor at Tufts University. These are pretty impressive credentials for a person arguing on the topic of reading. When we look at this other source, Is Google Making Us Stupid? An article about the internet's impact on our ability to engage in deep reading and concentrate. The author, Nicholas Carr, is a New York bestseller and a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He doesn't have a PhD on the subject like Marianne Wolf, yet he has some respect as a bestseller. When thinking about ethos, also think about the believability of the work itself. Has the work been carefully reviewed and scrutinized by a bunch of people with the relevant credentials, knowledge, and authority to critique the work? When we look at that first source by Marianne Wolf, we see up here that it's been published by Harvard. That's pretty good, I may say so myself. And when we look at the second source, it was published by the highly respected journal, The Atlantic. As you become more immersed in your discipline, you'll learn which venues, journals, and publishing companies are the most highly regarded. It's not enough that an author has a PhD or published with a prestigious publishing company. Does the author use enough evidence that is also believable and credible? Does the author present one or two studies to substantiate his or her claim, or a dozen studies? In addition to the quantity of evidence, what is the quality of the author's evidence? In this one example, Carr writes about a pathologist at University of Michigan who does research on the use of computers in medicine. He talks about his difficulty with focusing on longer reading passages. Bruce Friedman, who blogs regularly about the use of computers in medicine, also has described how the internet has altered his mental habits. I now have almost totally lost the ability to read and absorb a longish article on the web or in print, he wrote earlier this year. A pathologist who has long been on the faculty of the University of Michigan Medical School, Friedman elaborated on his comment in a telephone conversation with me. His thinking, he said, has taken on a staccato quality, reflecting the way he quickly scans short passages of text from many sources online. I can't read War and Peace anymore, he admitted. I've lost the ability to do that. Even a blog post of more than 3 or 4 paragraphs is too much to absorb. I skim it. Now, is this guy a reading specialist or brain specialist? No, he's just a person like you and me who claims to be affected by all this digital media. I would bet $100 that Carr is friends with this guy who probably made this comment when Carr was talking about writing his book about the internet's effect on the brain. Not the most credible source to prove his point. However, Carr does include credible sources at other parts of his article, like Marianne Wolfe, that professor from Tufts University. Also, what does the author purposely exclude from the audience? When we read, we seldom think about what's not on the page. What didn't make the cutting board? This reflects what the author values most and the author's purpose. The perfect way to explain this is to imagine walking into a Verizon store and you're looking for a new cell phone. The salesperson walks you over to the wall smartphone and boasts, "These are our finest cell phones." That's the main claim. What is the salesperson not showing you? What about all those feature phones behind the counter? Why does the salesperson exclude those from display? Well, smartphones not only cost more, but the data plans are quite costly, bringing in billions annually to telecommunication companies like Verizon. This salesperson probably makes commission off of these sales. What's excluded says everything about what is valued and makes clear the primary purpose of the claim. These are our finest cell phones. Now, some of you may be telling yourselves, I don't have a PhD, I've never been published. How can I get my audience to believe me? One way to phrase this question is to ask yourself, what contribution do you add to this discussion? Where's your authority on the topic? When we look back on Nicholas Carr's work, he's not a brain specialist or internet expert, yet he's old enough to remember what it was like to not have the internet and to all of a sudden have it available 24/7 in the palm of his hands. That's what Carr brings to the table, which is no surprise why the second and third paragraph of his article describes his personal experiences with the internet and its effects on the brain. I can feel it too. Over the past few years, I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. My mind isn't going, so far as I can tell, but it's changing. I'm not thinking the way I used to think. I can feel it most strongly when I'm reading. Immersing myself in a book or lengthy article used to be easy. My mind would get caught up in the narrative or the turns of the argument, and I'd spend hours strolling through long stretches of prose. That's rarely the case anymore. Now my concentration often starts to drift after 2 or 3 pages. I get fidgety, lose the thread, begin looking for something else to do. I feel as if I'm always dragging my wayward brain back to the text. The deep reading that used to come naturally has become a struggle. Carr then proceeds to talk about how Google has affected his work habits as a writer. If you had to write a paper on this topic, what would be your contribution? Well, if you were born in 1993 or 94, then that means you were born during the infancy of the internet. So there's no before and after for you. You've always had access to the internet. That's your authority. Nicholas Carr can't own that, nor can Professor Marianne Wolfe. You could write about what it's like to always have access to the internet. Or maybe you grew up in a rural area without access to the internet, but all your friends in town had access all the time. I'm guessing that's not Carr's story either. Again, that's your contribution, where you can speak with authority, whereas Carr can only speculate what it was like. Oftentimes, college students read a bunch of articles around a topic or theme, then come up with their great idea. I know, I'll argue that Google's making us stupid. Well, that was Carr's thesis, but what's your contribution to this topic? Students will read an article with a thesis they agree with and decide that they'll argue the same thesis. Well, again, that's that person's thesis. What do you plan to say? It's not that writing is about one thesis per person on this planet, but it's about deciding what you bring to the table. This could mean that you have your own personal experiences and you can speak with authority, because there is only one of you on this planet. Or you can argue that same thesis with more current research or research from other disciplines like computer science, education, and humanities. Or you could synthesize and analyze that same kinds of evidence from a different perspective or think outside the box. Let's review briefly. When thinking about ethos, assess the believability of both the author, his or her credentials, and the authority of the publication source, as well as the believability and reliability of the work itself and the author's use of evidence. And when you're asked to write a paper on the same topic, rather than just piggybacking on someone else's thesis, ask yourself, what's your contribution to the discussion? What's your authority? This concludes my video on how to establish ethos in writing.
So now that we have listened to another person's point of view on ethos and writing, let's take another look at why grammar matters to people other than Aristotle. Grammar itself allows us to talk about language. It names certain types of words which help us analyze their placement and usage. So basically, if a sentence does not make sense and you say it doesn't have a subject, then I can tell the person, oh, you need to add a subject to this sentence to make it more clear. Grammar also allows us to determine the meaning and understand the writer's intent. So all of that literature analysis that you were doing in high school and reading stories and talking about stories within groups of other classmates or with your teacher allowed you to say, oh, well, this poem is very dark and moody, and I can tell that because it describes, it uses words like dark, angry, foreboding, things of that nature. Grammar is ultimately about correctness, but it's really a way for us to focus on language.